Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly show produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, looking at news from around the world. And a lot of news there is to talk about. We'll start with Volodymyr. Tell me, do that again. We'll start with Volodymyr Zelensky's world tour, starting in Europe to get weapons, then to the Arab League to give a scolding to the Arabs, and finally to the G7 summit in Japan. Then we'll take a close look at that G7 summit, what it did with regard to Ukraine, but especially with regard to China, and how the G7 countries tried to get the global South to be a partner in what they are up to. And then finally, elections in the Mediterranean. We'll have on Sunday the second round of the elections in Turkey, and later in June, a second round for elections in Greece. Here to talk about all of these issues are Karen DeYoung, associate editor and national security correspondent for the Washington Post. Karen, great to have you.
Thank you.
And Steve Erlanger, chief diplomatic correspondent of the New York Times, based in Brussels. Steve, great to have you back.
Thank you.
And Peter Spiegel, U.S. national editor of the Financial Times. Peter, great to have you.
I'm tempted to mispronounce your name, Ivo. I'm sure that's never happened to you before.
Yeah, it's never happened to me.
Zelensky's
exactly.
Honor, yes.
No, it's why our kids are Mark and Michael. Anyway, Karen, let's start with you.
Yes.
Zelensky's world tour, really something to behold. He was in Europe, then he went to the Middle East, and then he flew to Japan. He probably met with more international leaders than you can possibly do in a week, but he accomplished it. It was a remarkable diplomatic feat, and it seems to have produced at least some results. Tell us about why he went, where he went, and what he got.
Thank you. Well, Zelensky is probably the best salesman for his own country. He uses his personal charisma, his always bettering English skills, and his wardrobe to project, the plucky leader of a nation at war. He's got a lot of personal charisma, and he manages to simultaneously be grateful, chiding, and inspirational. And I think all of those things were on view during this world tour. This was the longest trip he ever took, I think, since the war started. And he started in Europe with a stop in Germany, a country that for the past year has been the sort of reluctant partner, most of last year at least, of Europe and NATO, and walked away with big new pledges of support. He went to Italy, he went to France, and then he went to Britain, which kind of continued in its role as a sort of plucky vanguard of sophisticated weapons systems to Ukraine. Prime Minister Sunak announced that they would send some of the longer range armaments that Kyiv has been looking for, and that the United States has refused to send them, specifically the Storm Shadow cruise missiles. And he promised in a subsequent meeting with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands that they would work toward training Ukrainian pilots on fourth-generation fighter jets that the Ukrainians have also badly wanted, and gave strong indications that the planes themselves, specifically F-16s, were likely next on the list of sending sophisticated weapons to Ukraine. Then he went to Saudi Arabia at the Saudi invitation to attend the Arab League meeting there. As he always does, he tailored his message directly to his audience, many of whom have been fence sitters on the Ukraine war, have generally voted with UN resolutions to tell the Russians they've been bad, but have not contributed a lot of assistance and have not specifically bilaterally condemned Russia, which they have most of them have pretty good relations with. He made an emotional appeal to support. You said he called them hypocrites. I'm not sure he he certainly indirectly did that. He said, there have been a lot of really long-term wars in your part of the world, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Somalia, Iraq, Afghanistan, and you guys all have histories of anti-imperialism and anti-colonialism, and that's what we're fighting, and you need to be with us. I'm not sure who he convinced, but the mere fact that he was there and that they entertained him, I think was a real, from Ukraine's point of view, a real sign of progress. He went from there, as you said, on a French government plane straight to Japan, to the G7 conference. And I think that sort of overshadowed simultaneous bad news from Bakhmut, where the Russians said that they had overtaken the rest of the city that they've been fighting this grueling battle for months. He had bilaterals in Japan with most of the people he'd already met with in Europe and with Biden. He gave his inspirational and chiding speech, asking for more aid. He met with some of the fence sitters. He met with Prime Minister Modi. That was a step forward. He did not meet with President Lula. He had a meeting scheduled, and depending on whether you listen to the Brazilian version or the Zelensky version, Zelensky didn't show up, or the timing was confused. But I think that Lula has said he wants to be a peacemaker between Ukraine and Russia. And I think that sort of initiative is not really going to go anywhere now. Biden, whose aides had been negotiating for weeks with the Europeans over their desire to supply Ukraine with the F-16s that it wants from their own arsenals, kind of bit the bullet and said that the United States would participate in a training program in Europe for pilots, and that the United States would not stand in the way of European countries who needed U.S. permission to transfer their own F-16 jets to Ukraine. I don't think the Americans were too happy about that, even as they acceded to it. There was a news conference yesterday where Defense Secretary Austin and General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, really kind of defended U.S. reluctance up to now to supply F-16s, and kind of repeated all their reasons why they thought it wasn't the best idea in the world. They're really expensive, and they will take a big bite out of the budgets that all of these countries have set for giving aid to Ukraine. They require a whole lot of maintenance, and they reminded the Ukrainians that while they'll probably eventually get several dozen of these planes at some point, Russia has thousands of comparable aircraft. Austin and Milley had a press conference yesterday after the latest meeting, this one virtual, of the Ramstein group of coalition countries, and they announced that Denmark and the Netherlands would head a sort of subcommittee of that group to figure out how, when, where to do the pilot training and figure out maintenance and sustainment for these sophisticated aircraft, and eventually the provision of actual planes. So that's where we are as spring and harder ground came to Ukraine. And I think it's going to be a long time, certainly not far from the end of the year, if even then, that F-16s actually arrive there, and not in time for this current counteroffensive.
Karen, can I ask you to just go back to the G7 meeting, particularly this meeting with Modi and non-meeting with Lula? Because one of the narratives that has built up is that the U.S. in particular is ignoring the global South, in that they're not. Some of them are not only just fence sitters, but it was weird once Lula gets elected. It was almost a reconstitution of the BRICS, right? You had Lula almost out and out backing the Russians, and clearly we know the Indians have been buying Russian gas at discounts, and so they're providing hard currency. Tell me a little bit about where you think that it now sits post G7, if that's changed at all, or whether the U.S. and the West is really losing the narrative with the global South.
I think that you have to take these countries, these big countries, these leader countries in the global South, India, Brazil, certainly among them. They want to have a role. They see themselves as peacemakers, They don't see, they don't see the narrative quite the way the United States sees it. As a black and white, all good. They have their own gripes against the United States, and they have their own economic interests. Certainly, in the case of India, they desperately need energy resources, and they're not going to cut the Russians off. I think Lula sees himself in the sort of non-aligned tradition as a leader, and they see BRIC, which had kind of fallen into the doldrums, as a vehicle to sort of bring that back. I don't think any real progress was made, but I don't think that they've tipped in the other direction toward Russia either. I think they like the role of being, sort of sitting there and saying, well, we're above or below or whatever, all of this. I mean, you listen to Brazil, which is on the UN Security Council now. So every time they have a debate over Ukraine, which they frequently do, and it usually turns into just kind of an insult match between the Russians and the Americans and Europeans, with the Chinese sort of saying, this can't go on. Why can't we all be friends? Brazil is pretty tough in saying, in not taking the Western line. Not necessarily taking the Russian line, but from the U.S. perspective, that's the default position. If you're not with us, you're against us.
Yeah, and we should mention South Africa as the other sort of BRIC country that, although I don't think they were in at the G7, they too launched a peace mission. So very similar to the way Karen, you said these countries want to be seen as being part of, if not the solution, at least being taken seriously. Steve, I think Karen did a wonderful job of sort of laying out the whole effort by Zelensky to get what he's been trying to do from the very beginning, to get the West to give him more capabilities than the West has been willing to give him, particularly with regard to the F-16s. I guess the real fundamental question is, how much does it matter? That is, the kind of things that he got in the last week or two in his travels, the F-16s may not be there, as Karen said, till well after the counteroffensive has been launched and presumably been concluded. Some of the other stuff that is coming from the Germans and the French may be more significant and can be delivered a little earlier. But how much should it matter? And where are we in this war? Bakhmut fell at the same time that the Ukrainians were regaining a lot of territory, relatively speaking, in that area around Bakhmut. And of course, this much vaunted counteroffensive may have already begun, at least in terms of some of the deeper strikes, but is coming along. So how do you see this?
Well, there's this, I have to keep telling my editors, the US and NATO's been doing is trying to come up with a medium-term plan for Ukraine for weapons supplies beyond this year, because no one expects the war to end very soon. What worries me and worries quite a lot of NATO people is Ukraine's pretty well set up in terms of equipment and ammunition for this counteroffensive. They could always want more. And they've trained their troops and so on. But if this counteroffensive doesn't prove to be the huge success that very few people think it will be, though perhaps it will be, and Russia still controls a significant portion of Ukrainian territory, where does the equipment for another counteroffensive come from? We're scrambling for ammunition. We don't have enough air defenses ourselves. We weren't planning on this kind of war. We don't have enough tanks. It takes a long time to put all this stuff together. So that's why this counteroffensive feels so important, and maybe we're overestimating how important it is. But, Bakhmut always seemed to me just a place for the two sides to exhaust one another. I just worry. I mean, what's going to happen in the autumn, I think, once this counteroffensive does whatever it can do, is people are going to have to think about, how does this war end? I mean, how does it end? Who pushes them to end? What are, everybody's got interests. Our interests are not the same as Ukraine's interests. You have more and more talk, certainly in Europe, but also a bit in Washington, about what kind of negotiation makes sense, what to tell Zelensky at the NATO summit in Vilnius. I just published a few hours ago. It's a debate story, really, just looking at Germany, which was divided as Ukraine is divided, but somehow got into NATO in 1955 despite being divided. Now, is that any kind of model if this battle ends in pretty fixed battle lines? The Russians may not want to talk, and Zelensky may not want to talk, but if at least the question arises, if Ukraine has 90% of its territory and the lines are pretty fixed, what about taking that into NATO and simply putting, as the Germans did, unification in the bank to talk about later?
Steve, can I ask you, though, because there is this slight dichotomy in this debate, because the Europeans, you're right, have been much more, we need to talk, we need to figure out an end game here. And yet, this last week or two, it has been the Europeans, the Storm Shadows coming out of the UK, the F-16s coming out of the Netherlands, that the Germans suddenly throwing all in on the equipment side. We seem to not worry anymore that upping our aid to the Ukrainians is going to provoke the Russians. And now you have this slightly weird thing where you have Ukrainian-backed Russians sort of doing a counter-incursion into Russia itself. I'm just wondering whether there is, in European capitals, in Brussels, do we not care about provoking Putin anymore? Is that because we've provoked him so much and he hasn't done anything? We're not worried about that anymore? It's just interesting to me that those red lines have all been crossed.
It's a very good question. I mean, I think people do worry. It's a bit, what they worry about is Sevastopol. They worry about Crimea. I don't think they worry about the rest of it escalating, but I think Putin's been pretty clear about Sevastopol, and we've talked about this before. It's a Russian national security interest. It's their Black Sea port. It's not about nationalism or ideology. It's about Russia and the Black Sea. It's their warm water port, kind of the way we used to joke Miami was for Canadians, right? It's their warm water port. So it is important, but the F-16s are kind of down the road. As General Cavoli said, Karen said this too. I mean, the Russians may have lost 100 jet fighters. They have 1,000 more. I mean, Russia is, not, its army's been a mess, that's for sure. And maybe it'll break and run. But there is more and more thinking of how to get into Putin's brain, if this is possible, that the military option is not going to work, and that he's better off trying to hold on to some of what he has, even though Zelensky won't like this. I mean, but if NATO membership pretty soon is on the table, that may be helpful, might be leverage, because nobody knows, are we going to have a 5-year war? Are we going to be arming Ukraine for 50 years? I mean, these are serious questions. They're expensive questions. And the Europeans quite rightly ask, well, the US wants to look at China, and China matters. And the US isn't going to want to fight 2 wars at the same time. And our industrial might be gearing up, but it's going to take quite a while if we really are going to have this land war going on for 4 years and years.
And what you think about Vilnius and about Ukraine in whatever configuration joining NATO in the short term?
I mean, we can spend the entire show on this, and we do need to move on. But let me make two observations to close it out and bring the conversation together. What's interesting to Peter's question about don't the Europeans worry about provoking Russia? The Europeans less so, but the Americans still very much do. And so the interesting thing is that long-range missiles we're talking 300 kilometers here. The ATACMS remain a subject not to be discussed with the Ukrainians because of the fear of escalation. And the same is true with F-16s. Yes, there is the argument that Karen rightly mentioned that Milley and Austin talk about it. They're very costly, and it's going to take a big bite out of, if we, the U.S., were to supply F-16, it's going to take a big bite out of the fixed amount of money we have available for supporting Ukraine. But they're also worried about escalation, and that's right there. Just footnote: the newly nominated chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General C.Q. Brown, Peter, I think you were there last year at Aspen, talked about the need to start training Ukrainian fighters in A-10s, which actually would help this offensive, which is kind of interesting. I think Brown is going to be very different than Milley on this war.
Right at the start for
exactly, and it's
said no way.
Those are ground attacks. Just so people know, there's a ground attack airplanes as opposed to F-16s, which are mostly air to air. So it's much more useful in a
exactly.
ground war.
And sort of having an Air Force person there versus an Army person may matter. On the issue of NATO, though, that is still, I think, particularly in Western Europe and in the United States, seen as a bridge too far. And they are not prepared.
Bridge too far now, absolutely.
Absolutely. They are not prepared to even start thinking about how you do it. And I think, Steve, I haven't seen your piece, but I've been doing a lot of thinking as well about how do you bring a country with contested borders and not in control of its entire territory into NATO. There's the German example, as you mentioned. There's also a very different example. There's the Japan example. So the United States has an Article 5 guarantee to Japan that explicitly says it is only applicable to the territories that Japan controls. Now, Japan does not control the 4 northern territories, which the Russians took at the end of World War II. And as a result, there is no Article 5 commitment to those territories, even though both the United States and Japan recognize that those territories are Japanese. So
I should have talked to you before finishing this piece.
It's online.
Listen, it's never too late to amend when you do it online. So anyway, it's a really interesting idea, and sort of it gets to this larger issue, which is we have been looking at this war in terms of territory. And territory is important because that's how we define sovereignty and independence and political control. But it's really about the future of Ukraine. And who gets to decide that future, Moscow or Kyiv? And if Kyiv says we want to be part of the West, we want to be part of Europe, what is the Western answer? And that's what Vilnius is going to be about, because half the alliance says we want them as members, and the other half, including the United States, says not now, not tomorrow, and we really don't know about forever. So that's the debate. It seems to me we get there. As I said, we can go on for a while on this, but let's quickly, Steve, shift to the G7, which was overshadowed in some ways by Zelensky's visit there, and in some ways overshadowed by, as usual, American domestic politics and the negotiations about the debt ceiling or whether or not the U.S. is going to default. I think that's the negotiation. But there were some really important set of issues discussed among the G7 with regard to China. And of course, this attempt by the G7, by the Japanese, to bring in the global South and start making the case that we need to be together as we think about this order that is changing at the era of great power competition. So bring us up to date on the Hiroshima meeting a week ago.
Great. Well, we started to talk about it earlier very, very well, I think. So I don't want to repeat all that. But the White House seemed very happy. Apparently, Jake Sullivan sent a memo to his staff. I think the Washington Post reported it. About how happy he was the way it all came out. And of course, everyone likes to pat themselves on the back. I think it came out okay. I mean, the fact of the matter is, Jake Sullivan calls the G7 the steering committee of the free world. Well, that's a kind of limited view of the free world, perhaps, and maybe it's a bit arrogant about steering whom toward what. But having said that, the outreach to the global south is real, and it's important because China and Russia are appealing to countries that are a little sick of American hegemony, feel a little bit patronized, who are a little tired of the way the IMF is run and the World Bank is run, who think the UN Security Council is out of date, and who, have their own notions of what Ukraine means, what it means in terms of money, in terms of food prices, in terms of gas prices. And they are open to Chinese influence and Chinese business and Chinese money. And it makes perfect sense that they would be. I mean, the United States likes to say, oh, we're so strong because we have all these allies and China has no allies. Well, yes and no. I mean, China may not have allies, but it has a limited partner, which is becoming a subordinate partner in a pretty powerful country called Russia. It has a lot of influence in its own region. It has increasing influence in Africa, which also Russia does through this Wagner group. It's money, it's military, and in general, they're propping up governments that don't particularly want to be told by democratic nations how awful they are. And so it really is a sort of ideological competition, which I think is important. And, the G7, I think, particularly with the Japanese, made a very serious effort to pull these countries together. The statement on China was pretty strong, I have to say. And in a way, you knew it worked because the Chinese were so angry about it. That's one good way of sort of knowing if you throw a rock and it doesn't hit anything, that doesn't really matter. But this did seem to touch on a real nerve. But there's a long way to go. I mean, talking to, Europeans, they recognize a threat China poses to them, to their industry, to their intellectual property. They worry about Chinese espionage, but they really aren't in the American boat. I mean, this was very clear, not just from Emmanuel Macron when he talked about vassalization, that Europe shouldn't be a vassal to the United States over the issue of Taiwan. And for the United States, Taiwan stands for quite a lot of things, and Europeans and the global South worry a little bit that the US is pushing China hard enough that China is going to respond in ways that will damage them. And the big worry they have is if Taiwan blows up, so does the global economy, and nobody wants to deal with that at all. So, this is what surrounds these meetings. The meetings themselves, I think, matter. They're very rhetorical, but the conflict, the push, the pull is intricate and I think really important and hardly finished.
Steve, I think that's really, you set up really two very big pieces that I think are part of the puzzle, the sort of this global South competition between the United States and China, and how the global South as agency. Peter, your paper today has a piece about how in Latin America, open arms to China, and this wonderful quote by I think a foreign minister in one of the countries, I don't remember who it was, but that said, the U.S. are like Catholics. They want confession and confession and confession. And the Chinese are like Mormons. They knock on the door and said, we're here to help. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was exactly sort of a nice way to put it. And I think Steve's point, and Peter just elaborate on Steve's point on sort of how the two sides are looking towards the global South and trying to play it in a very, very different way. using economic leverage in the case of the Chinese, and the U.S. sort of holier than thou, human rights, democracy, etc. I was in Japan, and the Japanese and everyone else said this democracy autocracy framework doesn't work for us. It's rules based versus non-rules based.
And don't forget Xi's trip to the Middle East, where he, in some ways, played a brokering role with the Saudis and the Iranians. So, I mean, they're clearly trying to, and frankly, even in Davos, for those of you who attended Davos, I mean, there was a clear effort to hive the Europeans away from the Americans, right? We're open for business with the Europeans and not so much with the Americans. So they're trying to play their cards here. I will still express some skepticism about Chinese geostrategic tactics here, because a couple things I think worth noting. One, if you look at the areas, Belt and Road, and some of these other efforts the Chinese have made for economic vassalship, or whatever you want to call it, it's begun to anger a lot of the global South, right? In Africa in particular, Pakistan, and other countries that have been sort of saddled with debt in Belt and Road, it hasn't been that successful. I think the other thing which is counterbalancing it is, in some ways, Xi's militantism, for lack of a better word, almost bearing his fangs too early, has frightened a lot of people. And if you go to the region, particularly, because I was also in Japan recently, I mean, the Japanese are doubling their military spending. They are buying long-term strike into China. The Koreans, obviously, there's the state visit from the Korean president is asking for the U.S. to send nuclear-powered submarines and other platforms to Korea. You have the Philippines that are inviting American troops back to Philippine bases. You have the Australians in AUKUS. So I think there is a bit of diplomatic show going on right now. But if you look at the way the world is behaving, they are rearming, and they're rearming because they're frightened of the Chinese, not because they think that they're welcoming them. The other point I'll just make is something domestic, which I've noticed over the last 6 weeks to 2-3 months. There used to be, I think, in this country, something that is called the peace interest, and the peace interest tended to be Wall Street and Silicon Valley. They would look at Washington and say, those nuts in Washington are all a bunch of hardliners who can take us to war. And this happened, dating back, J.P. Morgan during World War I, where they kind of were arguing against a war. Business interests tend to argue against war. I have noticed a perceptive change in view within the business community, both here in Wall Street and Silicon Valley, where they are now almost afraid to send their executives to China because of some of the ways that Americans and other Westerners are being treated in China. There's searches going on at consulting firms and accounting firms. So I think attitudes are hardening in the U.S. And I think if you look at what they do, not necessarily what they say, in a lot of the other, obviously our treaty allies in Asia are not the global South. But if you look at what is happening, particularly in the China's near area, they are rearming because they're worried about Chinese aggressiveness and the collapse of the global order. And I think that is actually the overall narrative, much more so than China is making progress in Latin America or Africa, to be honest with you.
Yeah, and I guess, Karen, to you, this point about the worry about the collapse of the global order on the one hand, and then the global South, you mentioned Brazil earlier, South Africa, India, listen, the order as it exists today it reflects a power the way the power was distributed a long time ago, and we really need to update this. And the Chinese, in some ways, are playing into that disquiet that Steve also pointed out, and it seems to me that in Washington we're just not having that conversation.
Washington is we are the good guys, they are the bad guys, and the rest of the world doesn't necessarily divide the world up in those ways. I would take a little bit of issue about the rearming. Yes, that obviously catches a lot of attention. But if you look at a place like Latin America, where it's not like Africa, it's not where they're building up these big debts. It's much more the Chinese have gone and done open bidding and beaten the Americans again and again and again on critical minerals, on infrastructure projects. They're learning. They're learning to invest in stuff that countries like Chile or Colombia care about. climate.
When you say they, the Chinese are learning.
The Chinese, yeah. And they feel, those countries sometimes feel that the Americans are just not there. They're sort of dropping in every once in a while. They talk about big investment programs, mostly from the private sector, and nobody sees where the investment is. And meanwhile, the Chinese, our line about this is, be careful with the Chinese because they're just going to build up a bunch of debt and then they're going to screw you with it. But that's not necessarily the experience of some of these countries, certainly in South America. And so, I think that we've got this hard line, and we're not. We talk a good game as Steve said, at the UN, at the IMF, at some of these places, saying that yes, we recognize that the rules that we and our friends put in place after World War II don't necessarily reflect the world as it is today. We hear you. We're going to make some changes, but nobody's seen any of those changes actually happen yet.
Yeah, and it's not happening in the World Bank. It's not happening in the IMF. It's certainly not happening in the Security Council.
No. Although we talk about it a lot.
But we've been talking about it for a very long time, and then nothing happened. So I think this bears watching. This sort of competition about the narrative in which we tend to see the global South. We even talk about them as fence sitters, that they have to choose one side or the other. Actually, they're out for themselves, which is what most countries tend to be.
And then we also use this rhetoric and say, we're not asking them to choose. But yes, we are.
but we are. Well, fence sitters are by definition, you're either one side or the other side. So it kind of, the name alone sort of says you don't have agency. You got to, your agency is to choose, not to figure out your own way and have us adjust to it. Fascinating conversation on this. But let's, in a few minutes we have left, Peter, shift to really two interesting and really important elections. The still surprising outcome of 2 Sundays ago, Erdogan almost getting 50% of the presidential vote, and importantly, his party and coalition retaining control of the parliament. We have a runoff because he didn't get 50% on Sunday, and then perhaps even a more surprising victory by the Greek government, increasing its majority and now saying we need a runoff so we can have complete control under a new election law. And that is happening in June, setting up, frankly, the two governments who over the past 2 years have been at loggerheads, not yet shooting at each other, but getting close. As has been their want. So bring us up to date. You were just in Greece.
Yeah, I mean, this is the point exactly the point I wanted to emphasize, Ivo, which is, sort of we've forgotten about the Eastern Med because of the dominant role the Ukraine war and frankly, conflict with China has played on our sort of foreign policy minds. But pre-war, this was quite possibly the biggest flashpoint we were worried about, right? And it's all about energy resources. We found oil and gas in the Eastern Med. The Turks start putting up their military, their navy in what is essentially international waters, but frankly, Greek Cypriot waters. The NATO tries to intervene. The Greeks get very angry. And as you said, what you had here, obviously in Erdogan, and we know Erdogan is a nationalist, and in the run-up to the election, he was pounding the table in nationalistic ways. He was threatening to send missiles into Athens. He was displaying maps that showed Greek islands were actually part of Turkey. But again, you have to look at the other side as well. In Kyriakos Mitsotakis, who is the prime minister, head of a center-right party called New Democracy, who, as you said, Ivo, surprisingly won 41%, which is well above what people expected, and likely to get a full majority in the second round. He has a party that is very difficult to manage. He himself, I always joke with him because I saw him when I was in Athens. He's sort of the Rockefeller Republicans of old, the Northeast Republicans. He's a pro-business, center-right guy, went to Harvard, went to Stanford, worked at McKinsey, but he's got a party that is made up of a lot of real hardcore nationalists. And the nationalists in Greece are very anti-Turkey, and they are beginning to themselves rile up the local population and saying, hey, we have Turkish military airplanes flying over Greek islands. Why are we not responding? And so he's got to manage a party that is very fractious and very difficult. And frankly, there's a bit of a family history there. His sister, Dora Bakianis, she wanted to become prime minister and lost because of the nationalist wing of the party, sort of usurped her. His father was similarly usurped by the nationalist wing of New Democracy. So he's got to manage his own domestic politics as well. And when you have Erdogan banging the table because of a domestic economy that is frankly in shatters and getting gotten worse. The lira, I think I just checked before we signed on, was at the lowest level in history against the dollar because people are afraid of Erdogan's economic policies, and basically the backlash from the earthquake, where he mismanaged that as well. He's been forced to really go back to those nationalistic expansionist policies, to be honest with you, and we have the potential with two very strong-willed parties, two strong-willed leaders, of real conflict in the Eastern Med. And I think sometimes we forget about that because we've been focusing rightly on China and Russia, Ukraine. But it is really a very dangerous part of the world, and there's a lot at stake because of some of those energy resources found in and around Israel and Cyprus and Egypt in the last 5 to 6 years.
Yeah, and Steve, I mean, the idea that we heard in the months running up to this election that Erdogan was playing a nationalist card in order to win the election may be true, but given the economic problems and all the problems that will remain the day after the election, assuming he wins, which by all accounts it looks like he will, the third party through their support behind Erdogan earlier this week as well. He's not going to. Is there any reason to think that he's going to give up that nationalist card? Given the lira, I think, is now trading at 1.20 to the dollar.
Yeah. No, I mean, he's not going to give it up, but a lot of people think he's going to mute it now that he will have won again, because he does have this economic mess and he's got to deal with it, and he can't deal with two messes at the same time. So nobody, he's become so authoritarian and so closed in on himself. He's very hard to read, right? I mean, it's very hard to predict. But a lot of people feel he will, once the Swedish counterterrorism law, the new one, goes into effect June 1st, that he will let Sweden into NATO because he actually would like to patch things up a bit with allies and with the United States. He would like the F-16s, speaking again of F-16s, he'd like that purchase to go through, their F-16s, but also upgrading kits for older F-16s, which Congress is holding up in part because of Sweden. And he is going to continue to crack down on dissent. That's part of the problem. In a way, it's easier for Europe because now they can say, oh, well, it's Erdogan again. We don't have to deal with the Turks. But the fact is, I suspect domestically it's going to get tougher because you have mayoral elections in the big cities coming up in a year, cities that he lost last time. And I think he's going to do whatever he can to win them back. So I suspect domestically this tone will continue, though most people I talk to expect him on foreign policy terms to make some gestures to even things out. Now, this may be wrong.
I never want to disagree with the great Steve Erlanger, but I have to say, I just disagree with this narrative.
It is wrong. Okay.
Steve, you've been at this longer than I have, but how many times have we heard, if we just get Erdogan through the next election, if we just get Erdogan through the next whatever, he'll moderate himself, we'll have peace in Cyprus, we'll have, Sweden NATO membership, and it never happens. You never said that, but I had been in Brussels where this discussion is constantly happening. Erdogan, remember when he was first in office, he was a moderate guy, he was anti-military. If we just get to the next election, we'll get that. And it just gets worse. He's pro-Russian, he's anti-NATO, there's no peace in Cyprus. I mean, there's been no evidence that if we just get through the next whatever with Erdogan, that he'll moderate. And frankly, the Greeks were even thinking about this. If we just get Erdogan through the next election, maybe we can have some discussion about islands and sovereignty and stuff like that. And I was like, where's any evidence that Erdogan has ever moderated after an election? So I'm sorry. Steve, I didn't want to disagree with you that vehemently. I just am so skeptical about this narrative.
I don't know is the point. And we will have to see.
Karen, you may not know either. But although if you do, please enlighten us. But in the minute or so left, when you talked to your sources back in Washington, I mean, there clearly was a hope before the first round that Erdogan would lose. That's not happening. Or at least it looks like it's not happening. The Turkish voters are the ones to make that decision and they haven't voted yet. But assuming it doesn't happen, what do you hear on sort of their expectation? Not just, I think Sweden getting into NATO is probably going to happen, but more deeply about how they're going to deal with Erdogan, who has not been the easiest person to deal with for the United States, which, by the way, Europe says it's your problem. You figure it out. Even when I was at NATO, I was always the one who had to figure out the Turks. as if they were like ours, but that's how the Europeans look at it.
I think the administration is willing to deal with, kind of just sort of shrug their shoulders and say, "Oh, it's Erdogan again. We'll deal with him." Their problem is Congress. Turkey has very few friends in Congress. They don't like Erdogan. They don't like Turkey, and I think they're going to make any administration attempts without a significant gesture from Erdogan himself, which I agree with Peter. I'm not quite sure that's coming. They're just not going to budge. They don't want to give him the F-16s. They don't even want to give him the upgrade packages. And I think that the administration has a lot of fish to fry on foreign policy with Congress, and that's a pretty, not to mix my metaphors, but that's a pretty steep hill to climb. They don't like, the Congress does not like Turkey.
Congress does not like Turkey. Congress does not like Erdogan. Unfortunately, the voters in Turkey seem to like him enough to give him another term. And that's how that cookie crumbles, to really start getting all of our metaphors in.
I'm going to climb the hill, fry the fish, and eat the cookies.
And with that, I want to thank Steve Erlanger, Karen DeYoung, and Peter Spiegel for another great conversation. And thank you for tuning in. Tune in again next week for another edition of World Review. Until then, bye-bye and have a great weekend.